Hello, my name is Giorgio Shani, and welcome to the lecture on liberalism. This is part of the course Introduction to International Relations, which is recorded in the spring term of 2022. It is for the benefits of students enrolled in IRL 102 at International Christian University in Japan. Okay, for those of you who have watched the previous lecture on realism, you will notice a change in PowerPoint slides. Whereas the PowerPoint slides used for the lecture on realism focused on a nation state, and this accorded with the realist view of the world as divided into nation states as the basic political unit of international relations. The PowerPoint slides used for the lecture on liberalism show the globe. This is because liberalism is global or universal in scope. It may be seen as a unified political theory, arguably the most influential political theory in the world today, and certainly the dominant political theory in the West, including at ICU. It is universal in scope, meaning it applies to everyone, everywhere. So this marks a contrast with realism, which sees the world as divided into units, into the political units of the nation state, which has conflictual relations with each other. Okay. So by way of introduction, I will firstly expound upon the principal idea of liberalism, which is the ideal of liberty or freedom, which liberals consider to be a universal value. I will then introduce different levels of analysis. Now, the term levels of analysis within international relations derives from Kenneth Waltz's book, Man, State, and War, in which he examined different levels of analysis, meaning different levels of explanation for the causes of war. What I will do here is, instead of looking at war, look at liberalism and look at liberal views on different levels of analysis, specifically the individual, the state, and the system. These were the levels of analysis which Kenneth Waltz introduced into the literature on international relations. We will then examine different types of liberalism within international relations. So there is a distinction here between liberalism as a theory of domestic politics and liberalism as a theory of international relations. As a theory of domestic politics, liberalism seeks to maximize liberty within the unit of the state. Within international relations, it encounters an anarchic structure or an anarchic system. So this gives rise to different views on how liberalism should impact international relations and how it should try to mitigate, meaning to try to come to terms with or minimize the anarchic nature of the system itself, as realists have described it. We will conclude, and we may turn to a case study which will be discussed in class on Thursday. Okay, as previously mentioned, liberalism believes in the basic principle of liberty, which they believe is a universal value. So liberalism as an ideology comes from the normative value of liberty. A way of introducing the liberal dilemma, particularly as it applies to international relations, is the opening line from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Du Contrat Social, the social contract, which is seen as a book which directly inspired the French Revolution of 1789. In this book, Rousseau states in his opening lines, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. So man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Now, what he means by this is that man, meaning the individual human being, he was working and writing at the time in the early Enlightenment, when we use genders terms like man, but I will suggest that the term he wanted to use would be the individual, as in the individual human being. So man is born free, meaning man, the individual, is naturally free, has a right to liberty. But everywhere he is in chains, meaning human beings are unfree, even though they are supposed to be free. So there is a tension here between the analytical and the normative, or rather between the normative and the analytical. The idea that man is born free is a way of saying that man should be free, that the individual human being should be free. So this is explicitly a normative statement. And liberalism, unlike realism, can be seen as a normative theory. And it is not just the theory of international relations, but as previously mentioned, it is a political theory and also an economic theory. And arguably, it is the theory of modernity. It is the most important theory which has shaped the world in which we live. This is one argument which is made, particularly within the West. So the idea that man is born free can be seen as a normative statement. However, the second part of the statement, everywhere he is in chains, may be seen as an analytical statement. So this shows the central contradiction with which liberalism operates, which is this contradiction between the normative aspirations of liberalism to free and emancipate everybody, and a description of the world as a world where there are forms of unfreedom. Now, Rousseau believed that we should free, meaning we should emancipate those who are unfree. And by and large, liberals believe in this. They believe in the importance of emancipation, and of liberation. However, realism works within, as we'll see in later in the lecture, a world of nation states. It works within an international society. They will prefer the term society to system, structured by anarchy, meaning the absence of a common power. So in this sense, liberalism can be seen as a project. It is committed to the idea of liberty, which liberals believe leads to peace. So liberty, meaning freedom, is the best guarantee of peace and security. If people are free, then they're likely to be peaceful. This is because if we look at the economic theory of liberalism, liberty leads to prosperity. It leads to the formation of a market economy where people can freely buy and sell their own labor power and goods and services. And this leads to prosperity within society as a whole. So liberals believe that automatically liberty, meaning freedom, would lead to peace. They also believe, as I stated at the outset of the lecture, that liberty is a universal value. It is not seen as a particular value. It is not particular here to the West or to ICU. It is a value which applies to everyone, everywhere. And liberals have argued that if we look at all of the world's great philosophical traditions, then we will find a commitment here to liberty, to freedom. So liberty is seen as a universal value. It is seen as a good. Now, the contradiction is that this belief in liberty as a universal value and this commitment to the idea of liberty, which liberals believe will lead automatically to peace, brings liberalism and liberal states into conflict with ideologies and states which do not share these values. So if we look at the history of the 20th century as looked at through the prism of liberalism, which is the dominant way of looking at history within the West, this sees the 20th century as a triumph for democracy and freedom against fascism within the Second World War and later communism within the Cold War. So fascism and communism are seen as ideologies which contradict the values of liberalism. So fascists prioritize the importance of the state and of the ethnically defined nation state. Fascists believe that war is a means to bring about greater glory for the state. Communists, on the other hand, although they believe in freedom, believe primarily in the idea of equality, and they subordinate liberty to this value of equality. And if we look at the case of Soviet socialism or Soviet communism, there we saw the Soviet Union did not respect the liberty of the individual, the liberty or the rights of the individual. Today, in the 20th century, liberals would argue that we are also confronting another threat to liberal values and to the liberal world order. This threat is posed by authoritarian populism. Authoritarian populism is linked to the rise of populist leaders who reject the liberal world order. So examples of these populist leaders would, of course, be Vladimir Putin in Russia. So this lecture is recorded in the backdrop of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and liberals would consider it to be an unjustifiable war, a war of aggression against Ukraine by Russia. But unlike realists, liberals would look at the regime, at the Russian regime, and they would argue that the Russian regime, although it claims to be democratic, and indeed Vladimir Putin is one of the world's longest serving democratically elected leaders. He has won elections, but liberals would say that Russia is not a liberal democracy, and Vladimir Putin may be seen as an authoritarian populist. He tries to centralize power and take away power from the people. And that this is the root and the cause of the aggression in Ukraine. It is not a war of Russia against Ukraine. It is a war of authoritarian populism against liberal democracy. Okay, so this, I hope, has introduced you in a nutshell, meaning in short, to the principal concern of liberalism, liberty, and its contradictions, which is it believes that liberalism, liberty, would lead to peace. However, it operates in an anarchical world in which there are other ideologies and where there are states which do not share these values. So how then does liberalism and how do liberal states engage with these states who have different values? Okay, now let's look at different levels of analysis. Now, the three levels of analysis, which are outlined at the start of the lecture, which derive from Kenneth Waltz's Man, State, and War, are the individual, the state, and the system. Now, above all, liberalism is the theory of the individual. We can trace its roots to Descartes' observation, je pense que je sois, I think, therefore I am, ergo cogito sum. So the basic unit of international relations for liberals is the individual, and the individual should be free. The individual predates the establishment of the state. We can even see this in the classic realist text of Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan. Hobbes starts not with a world of states, he starts with a world of individuals, a state of nature of individuals, where individuals freely give up their liberty, their natural rights to freedom in return for security. Now, liberals, following John Locke, whose work I will introduce later, believe that it is irrational for the individual to give up their natural rights to liberty, to freedom in return for security. They believe that, as we'll see later, they will need some guarantees from the state, and these guarantees are codified in law. So the individual is seen above all as rational. So in answer to the question, why should the individual be free? Early liberal thinkers argued that the individual should be free because the individual was rational. On the basis of the rationality of the individual, meaning that the individual was able to exercise reason, which is a key concept promoted by the European Enlightenment in the 18th century. It was seen as the age of reason. Individuals believe that the individual is autonomous, meaning that the individual is able to exercise agency. The individual can act on his or her own behalf. Finally, and this is particularly important when we look at the economic theory of liberalism, which favors free markets, or what Marxists will call capitalism. Liberals believe that the individual is self-interested. They're interested in themselves and in furthering their own self-interest. Liberals also believe that the individual knows her or his interests better than anyone else. This includes rulers. So the individual knows what is in their interest better than the sovereign, the king, the queen, the emperor, or religious figures. So this gives rise to a particular liberal theory of the state. Now, the liberal theory of the state is to liken it to a necessary evil. So liberals believe that it is necessary. We need the state because it protects us from anarchy. So in that sense, Hobbes was right. You know, we need a Leviathan, we need the state in order to protect us from other individuals within a state of nature. However, this huge concentration of power within the Leviathan can be used against individuals, can be used to take away the rights of individuals. So liberals believe that the state is a necessary evil. We need the state in order to maintain law, particularly the rule of law, which is seen as a supreme liberal value. However, we need protection from the state itself. And liberals believe that the best way of doing this is through a constitution. So a constitution can be seen as a set of rules which rule the government, a set of presets, rules, regulations, which clearly stipulate, which clarify the right of the state and the rights of citizens. Now, if we look at the classic understandings of liberalism, it is based on the idea of the separation of different forms of government. So for liberals, the state is not the same as just the executive. Following Montesquieu, there are three different powers or the different forms here of government. There is the executive, which makes decisions, the legislature, which deliberates, which drafts legislation and approves it, and the judiciary, which makes sure that what the executive does is lawful, is within the purview of the Constitution. So it's constitutional, it's legitimate. Now, the history of the 19th century can, however, be seen as a, if we look at the political history, of the 19th century, particularly within the West, can be seen as first a conflict, and secondly, as a marriage of two different concepts. One was liberalism, the idea here of liberty, which is enshrined within the rule of law. So as John Locke, who I'll be introducing later to you, said, freedom means having a standing rule to live by, meaning that where there is law, there is freedom. Democracy, on the other hand, basically meant rule of the majority. And initially, particularly in states such as the United Kingdom, which was the most important imperial power of its day and the place where the Industrial Revolution happened, we find that liberals were very hesitant to embrace democracy. They did not believe in extending the franchise, meaning giving more people the vote, because they felt that if you give more people the vote, particularly poor people the vote, they will take away your property. And liberals believe that there is a natural right to property. This is the foundation of the free market economy. However, during the 20th century, we have a marriage of these two ideas, liberalism and democracy. So liberals believe in a form of democracy which is a representative democracy, whereby we elect our representatives. Now, these representatives rule in our interest, but we also have the right to get rid of these representatives in elections which are held periodically. So liberals believe in a form of democracy which is called liberal democracy. Today, within the West, we understand this form of democracy as the only form of democracy. So liberals claim democracy really, or define democracy exclusively in liberal terms. In representative democracy is for them democracy. This is very different from the democracy of Athens, where people directly participated within the process of decision making. Now, as I mentioned, one of the key liberal theorists early liberal theorist is John Locke. Now, John Locke can be seen as an interlocutor with Thomas Hobbes. He was a contemporary. He wrote immediately after Thomas Hobbes. And like Thomas Hobbes, he started with the idea of a state of nature. So Hobbes introduced the idea of the state of nature within political theory. So Hobbes is seen as the innovator here of, or the father of modern political theory. So Locke argues that yes, Hobbes was right. There was a state of nature. And in this state of nature, we have a natural right of liberty. But he argues that the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone not to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So in other words, there are natural rights to life, liberty, and possessions. As previously mentioned, Locke believed that freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to everyone of that society and made by the legislative power erected in it. This is the principle of representative government in his treatises of government. And Locke's ideas were influential in the development of the United Kingdom, but more importantly, of the United States and its form of government. So this idea of democracy, but a democracy in which there is the rule of law, and that this rule of law is common to everyone of that society and made by the legislative power which is invested in it or erected in it. Now, to look at a contemporary example, we can look at what is happening in Locke's country of birth, which is the United Kingdom, where the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, who some liberals regard as a populist, has been accused and actually found guilty of breaking his own laws during the period of a COVID-19 lockdown within the United Kingdom. So he is alleged to have participated in a gathering, in a party, when people within the United Kingdom were told that they needed to stay at home in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19. So here we see that even though Boris Johnson is the Prime Minister, he came up with this legislation. This legislation applies to him as well as everybody else. So this idea of freedom of men under government means to have a standing rule to live by, which is common to everyone of that society, including the leaders, including the Prime Minister or President. Okay, Now, so far, we have only focused on the political theory of liberalism and how it has influenced the development of the state. Now, let us look at the interaction of liberalism with international relations. So, the dilemma which liberals face is how to deal with other ideologies and with states which do not share the same values which you believe are universal. Now, this has given rise to different forms of liberalism, and I will introduce three of them later. But the first response is to democratize. By democratize here, we mean to liberalize. In other words, to try and get those states which do not share the same values which you hold, particularly the value of liberty, to accept those values, to accept ideas of human rights in particular, which can be seen as the ultimate expression of liberal values, to restructure their political systems in order to allow for a separation of powers and in order to allow for elections, for the election of representatives to represent the people, and to make sure that the rule of law is enforced within a particular state. So democratization is the first response. A second response will be collective security. This is based on the idea that liberal states, i.e. those states which share a belief that liberty is the basic and universal value, should get together and protect themselves from threats which are posed by illiberal regimes and illiberal ideologies, such as fascism or communism, or arguably authoritarian populism. The best way of doing this, other liberals argue, will be to create institutions such as the United Nations and also regional organizations like the European Union, in which states can try and mitigate against anarchy by cooperating. So the idea of an international institutions is you bring states together, even though states have their own self-interest, according to realists. Liberals believe that all states potentially share an interest in peace and an interest in prosperity. And international institutions are a forum for bringing states together and pursuing common goals. This would give rise to the idea of interdependence. So interdependence means that states would then depend upon one another. So interdependence is specifically a theory which looks at international political economy, meaning that if states are dependent upon one another in terms of trading with one another, then they are unlikely to go to war. We will further elaborate upon this, but the liberal view is very much that the domestic, here it's seen as the domestic analogy, in the sense that the way in which your state is structured determines your conduct, determines the conduct of the state. Now, I would now introduce you to types of liberalism within international relations. The first type of liberalism can be seen as liberal internationalism. In contemporary international relations, particularly after 9/11, liberal internationalism has also been seen as influential in the development of neoconservative thinking. However, it is not conservative. I would say it's a misnomer. Liberal internationalism would be the appropriate term. Idealism, which was arguably the first great theory of international relations, which emerged after the First World War. So idealism is concerned with trying to prevent war through the rule of law. And as we'll see later, idealism has also surfaced in an attempt during the era of globalization in the 1990s to democratize international relations. And finally, the idea of liberal institutionalism. This is sometimes unhelpfully termed neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is seen as a dominant form of economics, which believes in free markets, whereas liberal institutionalism actually believes in the powers of institutions to mitigate anarchy. In other words, institutions provide goods and incentives for states to cooperate, to collaborate with one another, and to pursue common goals. And the great case studies are the United Nations and regional institutions such as the European Union. Okay, let us look at liberal internationalism first. So the liberal international response to the question of how to live in a world in which liberalism is not accepted as a universal value would be quite simple. We should make illiberal states liberal states. We should spread the universal values of liberal of liberalism, of liberty. In contemporary terms, this means we should make human rights universal, even if this means that we may need to go to war to do so. Now, liberal internationalist thinking is based on a reading, some scholars argue a misreading, of the work of Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that if all states become republican, republican in this sense would mean that they are a republic. They are not ruled by kings or queens, but there is a state which is responsive to the views of the people. There would be perpetual peace, meaning everlasting peace. Now, in the late 20th century, liberal theorists writing during the last days of the Cold War and the post-Cold War era understood Republican as liberal. And they argued that if all states would become liberal, there would be perpetual peace. This gave rise to a thesis, meaning a theory. If we look at a thesis, this would be an argument which would have the status of law. First posited by Michael Doyle, Bruce Rosick, and Jack Levy, that no two liberal democratic states had gone to war with each other. Therefore, the corollary was, meaning the flip side, was that all states should become liberal democratic if there is to be world peace. An extreme version of this view, which was put forward actually in the last days of the Soviet Union, and which gained great popularity after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was a thesis by Francis Fukuyama that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, history had ended. This, as we'll see, is based on a view of history, which was first put forward by George Hegel, which also inspired Karl Marx, who believed that history proceeded through conflict between different ideas, and that with the triumph of liberal democracy over communism, Fukuyama argued that history had ended and that there was no alternative to liberal democracy. Let us go back to Kant and to look at his preconditions for a perpetual peace. So Immanuel Kant was an Enlightenment philosopher. He was someone who was a Republican, not in an American political sense, but in a believer of the Republic and a believer in many senses in the French Revolution. However, he was somebody who also abhorred war, and he wanted to create a more peaceful world. So for Kant, in order to achieve a peaceful world, in order to achieve a perpetual peace, all states needed to sign up to 3 definitive articles. The first article is that the civil constitution of every state shall be republican. So basically what this means is that states should have constitutions. Many states at that time did not have constitutions. There were monarchies. Even the United Kingdom did not, and arguably still does not, have a constitution. So republican here means that there is some popular sovereignty. So sovereignty here resides in the people. This will be seen as a republican form of government. So the civil constitution of every state shall be republican, meaning that they should be republics. The right of nations, here nations refers to states, because we lived in a world before nationalism in many senses. The right of nations shall be based on a federation of free states, Foedum Pacificus. So the idea is that you have free states would get together and join this federation of free states. And in this federation of free states, there would be a cosmopolitan right, which would be limited to the conditions of universal hospitality. So what this means is that everybody would have the right to live and work, or in Kant's day, to travel to another state and enjoy the same rights that they would have in their own state. Now, this was very idealistic within the context of the late 18th century. However, Kant was writing at a time in which the French Revolution, the ideas of the French Revolution were shaping Europe and shaping international relations, particularly within Europe. Today, we see that Kant's 3 definitive articles are in fact reflected in regional organizations such as the European Union. So in order to join the European Union, you need to be a liberal democracy. You do not necessarily need to be a republic, but you need to be a liberal democracy, to be committed to human rights, to have a representative form of government. So this can be seen, the European Union can be seen as a federation here of free states committed to these values. And within the European Union, you have cosmopolitan right, meaning that under Article 51 of the, Article 50 of the EU Charter, there is free movement of people, meaning that people can move from one member state to another. So French people can live and work in Germany and have the same rights which they would have in France. Germans can live and work in Italy and have the same rights as they would have in Germany. Italians can live and work in Spain and have the same rights as they would have in Italy. So Kant's ideas have been influential regionally, but still we do not live in a Kantian world. They are not reflected explicitly within the Organization of the United Nations, even though member states of the United Nations are meant to be committed to human rights. They are not necessarily, all the members of the United States are not necessarily Republican, and you do not have the right of universal hospitality. So people from China, People's Republic of China, cannot work and live in Japan and enjoy the same rights they had in China. Similarly, people from Japan cannot work and live within China and have the same rights as they do in Japan. Okay, so as mentioned beforehand, the idea of the democratic peace thesis is a translation or the application of Kant's 3 definitive articles to contemporary international relations. So as Doyle, Russett, and Levy mentioned, if we see Kant's republics as modern-day liberal democracies, they have found a pattern. Liberal democracies rarely go to war against each other. The original statement of this was that liberal democracies do not go to war against each other. I will leave you to see whether the war between Russia and Ukraine can be seen as a war between 2 liberal democracies, but most liberals would argue that President Putin's regime, although it is maybe seen as democratic in that there are regular elections, is not a liberal democracy because there is no free press or independent reporting. So the first idea is that democracies rarely go to war with each other, but the flip side, the opposite side of the coin, is that democracies often go to war against non-democratic states. And as we'll see later, this actually becomes a criticism of the democratic peace thesis, that actually democracies have started more wars, at least since the collapse of the Soviet Union, than non-democratic states. So democracies often go to war against non-democratic states. Therefore, the democratic peace thesis argues that if all states become democratic, war would be unlikely. So this can be seen as a response here to the question of how liberal states should deal with illiberal states. So the argument is they should make them liberal. So war may be necessary to make states democratic and therefore peaceful. So liberals may argue that if we look, let's say, at the DPRK, North Korea regularly conducts military exercises which threatens the security of its neighbors, the Republic of Korea, ROK, and Japan. So the DPRK is not seen here as peaceful. It is being accused of trying to develop nuclear technology in order to attack its enemies. I would argue in order to protect itself. So liberal internationalists would argue that the best way to make the DPRK peaceful would be to democratize it. Now, the best way to democratize it may be regime change, to change the regime of the DPRK. So if we look at the Republic of Korea and Japan, meaning South Korea and Japan, South Korea and Japan have many differences, particularly over the role of Japan in the Second World War. However, relations between the Republic of Korea and Japan have improved during the post-war period. This is because both South Korea, at least since the 1980s, and Japan are liberal democracies. And the fact that they're liberal democracies means that war between them is unlikely, whereas there is more of a chance of war between Japan and the DPRK, North Korea. There's a far greater chance of war between Japan and the DPRK and Japan and South Korea. Now, as mentioned, perhaps the most extreme and popular version of the liberal international position was put forward by Francis Fukuyama in an article which was originally published in 1988 in the National Interest, which he further elaborated in a book, The End of History and the Last Man. Fukuyama bases his thesis, his thinking, upon the work of George Hegel, who, as I mentioned, influenced the thinking of Karl Marx. Now, Hegel argued that history would end when there are no contradictions, meaning when everybody here is free. So Hegel believed that human history proceeded through a period of conflict where there was conflict between an idea, a dominant idea, and another idea which challenged that idea. So his ideas were the ideas of freedom and the ideas of equality, for example. He believed these contradictory ideas conflicted against one another until we had the birth of modern constitutional regimes, which guaranteed equal freedom for people. So he believed that if everybody adopted these forms of government, then history would end. So history would end when there are no contradictions, meaning when everybody is equally free. So Fukuyama argued after the collapse of communism, or during the collapse of communism, that liberal democracy had no contradictions. It was based on equal freedom. Everybody was equally free. The end of the Cold War, therefore, for Fukuyama, signaled the end of history, meaning that the triumph of liberal democracy over communism. So he regarded liberal democracy here as a triumph. Communism did not collapse. It was defeated by liberal democracy because people who lived within Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union believed that liberty was a universal value. They preferred liberal democracy to Soviet communism. This is very different from the view, let's say, of Vladimir Putin, who believed that communism basically collapsed. It collapsed from within. And this was not linked to the popularity of ideas of liberal democracy. So Fukuyama's argument is the triumph of liberal democracy over communism means that there are no alternatives to it. There can still be isolated communist regimes or authoritarian regimes, such as the DPRK, arguably Russia today, or Iran, which is a democracy, but an Islamic democracy. But these regimes are not significant. They are outside here of history. Okay, I should mention that Fukuyama has recently revised a lot of the optimism of his arguments and actually argued that it is a pity that socialism is no longer a competitor to liberalism. But this was certainly a summary of his argument in the early 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now I would like to introduce you to a older, arguably an older way of thinking about liberalism and international relations, and perhaps the first international relations theory. And this is termed idealism, or at least it was termed idealism by E.H. Carr, who critiqued idealism in order to put forward his idea of realism. As the name suggests, idealism believes in ideals. It's a normative theory. It is based on the idea, to paraphrase Carr, to examine what ought to be rather than what is, and to make what is into what ought to be. So idealists believe in democratizing international relations, and they believe that this is necessary in order to ensure peace. So they differ from liberal internationalists in that they do not believe it is necessary to promote democracy through war. So war is not necessary to promote democracy. We should concentrate on democratizing the international system itself. Now, idealism can be traced back really to the foundations of the discipline of international relations in the Treaty of Versailles, the Peace of Versailles in 1919. And the key architect of the Peace of Versailles was the US President Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson argued that the best way to maintain peace was not necessarily to punish the aggressors. Here, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Turkey, although it should be mentioned that they were punished at the Peace of Versailles, but to restructure the international order. In 1919, the basic unit of international relations was empires. The world was divided into empires. And Wilson argued that instead of basing an international system on great powers and on realist ideas of the balance of power and on secret notions of diplomacy, we need to embrace the concept of national self-determination. So he believed that he called for the dissolution of the Empire of Austria-Hungary and to consolidate the units into nation states. So he argued that instead of just accepting Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire as well should be broken up into individual nation states. It should be noted, and this would be, as I'll explain later, a standard post-colonial and also a realist response to liberalism, that Wilson, although he conceded the idea of national self-determination, and he believed that the nation state should be the basic unit of an emerging international order, was reluctant to concede this principle outside of Europe. So if we contrast Austria-Hungary with the Ottoman Empire, we find that in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the successor states became nation states, and they were accepted into a collective security arrangement, which became the League of Nations, a forerunner to the United Nations. However, the successor states of the Ottoman Empire became mandated territories and were given to Britain and France. It should also be pointed out that the British and French empires, which were the two biggest empires in the world, had their empires intact. So under the League of Nations, although the main principle or the basic unit was the nation state, the British and French empires continued to represent the interests of the majority of the world. Now, Wilsonian ideas of national self-determination and collective security certainly influenced the development of the United Nations in the Second World War, and particularly in ideas of the importance of collective security arrangements, of international organizations, and the basic idea of national self-determination, which was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1960. In the 1990s, we find a different debate and a different form here of idealism. This debate is the debate on globalization. So the argument here was that globalization, the globalization of liberal values, of liberal democracy, and the globalization of a market economy basically makes the international system, which is based on the Westphalian system of territorialized nation state, obsolete. It endangers the system. So basically what we need is a transformation of political community. This is most articulately put forward in the work of David Held, the late David Held, in conjunction with others such as Daniel Archibugi, Mary Kaldor, and also Tony McGrew, when he argued that there needed to be a reconceptualization of the democracy, a more radical form of democracy, which was based not just on the nation state, but on different levels of democracy. So ideas of a cosmopolitan model of democracy would be that you have various forms of government. Local government, so you have local government should be democratic, democratic at the level of a nation state, and then you should have an international or regional levels of governance. So regional and also international levels of governments, which are based on notions that of democracy and of liberal democracy. So if we look at idealism, we can see that it has been a very influential form of dealing with the international. So the idea is, instead of changing the basic units and leaving the international system intact, this is what liberal internationalists argue. Idealists say, look, we have to change the system. We have to change the structure. Changing the structure of the international system means basically committing ourselves to ideas of national self-determination, collective security, and democratizing the international system. The international system, liberals argue, is not democratic today. You have 5 permanent members of the United Nations with the right of veto. And this is a problem in terms of inhibiting the way the United Nations works. Okay, now the third main type of liberalism within international relations is perhaps the type of liberalism which is closer here to realism. And this can be seen as liberal institutionalism. It is also known as neoliberalism. Now we can isolate 2 different forms of liberal institutionalism. One, which is focused very much on Europe, is the work of David Mitrani and his ideas of integration or integrationalism. And secondly, the work of Bob Keohane in the United States and his focus with Joseph Nye on interdependence, which is mainly based here on trade and on markets. Now, the basic arguments of liberal institutionalism is that institutions are important, and institutions help states mitigate the security dilemma. So the security dilemma is that if we look at realists, states cannot trust other states. Therefore, they always have to put their own interests first, and they need to maximize power. Liberal institutionalists believe that institutions provide states with a forum to get together, and through participating in international institutions, they begin to trust one another. So it's based on a realist idea that states obey rules out of self-interest. So international institutions such as the European Union and also regional security alliances such as the US-Japan Security Alliance, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the African Union. So international institutions and regional institutions encourage interdependence. We see this also within the United Nations system itself. So there is an interest. So states gain from participating within the international system, within international institutions. Interdependence means they begin to depend upon one another. And interdependence makes war unlikely. Therefore, institutions may be necessary to encourage peaceful relations between states. So the liberal institutionalist argument is to say that basically we can have peace even if the basic unit are not the same. In other words, even if states are illiberal and undemocratic, this does not necessarily mean that they will go to war with liberal democracies or that liberal democracies need to go to war with them. If both liberal and illiberal states join international institutions, then they will come to depend upon one another. And if they depend upon one another, then they're unlikely to go to war. Let me give you two case studies. One on integrationism, which looks at the work of Matreni, and the other one on interdependence, focusing more on Keohane's perspective. So if we look at integrationalism, we see that the project of the European Union started out really as an economic project, the creation of a European coal and steel corporation, the creation of a European market, a common European market. Now, this meant that previous antagonists, let's say France and Germany, the two most powerful economies within the European Union. These were two states which had gone to war 3 times from 1870 to 1945 and were on opposite sides of both the First and Second World Wars. Well, over a period of time, beginning with the Treaty of Rome in 1957, these European states, France, Germany, Italy, and the Benelux countries, started trading with one another. Their economies started becoming interdependent to such an extent that it's now difficult to tell what a French, German, or Italian company is. This led to the expansion of the European Common Market and the creation of political institutions such as the European Parliament and eventually the European Union. So today, it is almost impossible to tell the difference between French and German foreign policy. It is inconceivable that France and Germany would go to war with each other. They have, in many senses, a common European foreign policy, and they have become, from being enemies who fought 3 wars within 75 years, they have become the best of friends. Now, if we look at the Asia Pacific, we can look at relations between the United States and Japan. So if we look at relations between the United States and Japan, then since the defeat of Japan and since the American occupation, we've seen that Japan and the United States have traded with one another to such an extent that their economies are interdependent. Now, this makes war between them unlikely, irrespective of the domestic political arrangements. So if we look at Japan and the United States, then we see that their economies are interdependent. And although they went to war in 1941 to 1945, a repeat of this war is almost unthinkable today. Advocates of interdependence argue that the same could possibly be true with the People's Republic of China. The People's Republic of China has displaced Japan as the world's second largest economy. It has, since 1978, opened up to foreign direct investment, and it has embraced free market principles, and particularly the idea of free trade. So today, Japan, the People's Republic of China, and the United States are interdependent. They rely upon one another. This makes war unlikely between them, even though the People's Republic of China is not a liberal democracy. Even though it is a communist state, it is still unlikely to go to war with the United States, and Japan. However, the same is not true of the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. This is because the Korean economy, the North Korean economy, is closed. The state is closed. It does not trade with one another. It does not with Japan and the United States. It does not enjoy diplomatic relations with Japan and direct diplomatic relations with the United States. Therefore, it is more isolated and it poses more of a threat. So war is unlikely between China, the People's Republic of China, Japan, and the United States because their economies are interdependent and they trade with one another. However, war between the DPRK and Japan, or war in the DPRK and the United States, is possible and may be seen as likely because there is no interdependence. They do not rely upon one another. Okay, in order to summarize, let us look at these different types of liberalism in comparison. So please note that all these different ideas of liberalism share one idea in common, which is a belief in the universal value of liberty and a belief that the world, an ideal world, will be a liberal world or a liberal democratic world. So if we look at liberal internationalism, the main argument is that if all states become liberal, there will be perpetual peace, meaning there will be everlasting peace. So the focus is on the unit, on the character of the state. If we make states liberal, there will be peace. Idealists, on the other hand, focus on the system. They argue that international relations needs to democratize in order to lead to peace. So in other words, we can't have great powers. We can't have empires. We need to have a democratic United Nations where there is no permanent right of veto. We need to reconceptualize international relations at a structural level. And idealists, as the name would suggest, do not believe that war should be used as an instrument in order to change the domestic political arrangement of a regime. In other words, they don't believe in regime change, which liberal internationalists do. And if we look at liberal institutionalists believe that international institutions encourage peaceful relations between states, and that even illiberal states which are not democratic, can benefit from joining these institutions, and this would make war between them unlikely. So if we look at in conclusion, we see that what do all these different views of liberalism share in common? Well, aside from a belief in liberty, they believe that the individual is the main actor in international relations. that freedom is the basic value, and that interdependence, being mutually dependent upon one another, depending upon one another, would lead to peace. Now, what I would like to do in the lecture on Thursday is to apply this to our case study. Can the People's Republic of China rise peacefully? And how should the US and Japan respond? And you will see that there are different views to this question. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to joining you on class. Thank you very much.